only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's Ixion Partner webinar. I'm Jo Sears, Head of Group Subcontracting for Ixion Holdings, and delighted to be able to welcome you to this webinar. And today's webinar is going to be presented by Vicki Hardman from Learning Alike Organisation. And the topic is going to be around the environmental and sustainability management agenda. Now, before I hand you over to Vicki, I'd just like to point to the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. This gives you the opportunity to ask questions during the webinar, and during the session, Vicki will obviously take the appropriate opportunity to answer those questions to you. And also, if you do lose audio during this webinar, then there will be an opportunity to receive the full set of slides from us, and also an audio link to YouTube for the full webinar, so that you don't miss out on anything. There will also be a short survey at the end of the webinar. So once we close the session, there will be a short survey just to ask you for some feedback on the content of the session, and also any suggestions for future webinars that you would like to participate in. So at that point, I will hand you over to Vicki, and enjoy the session. Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you for inviting me. It's very good to be here. So basically, as Jo says, we're going to talk today about sustainability and environmental management. This is an area that Jo's indicated that Ixion are keen to look at both in their own organisation and across their supply chain. So that's basically the topic we'll be covering today. Jo, I had a poll for the attendees. Is that available now?
There we are. That is available and should be on screen now.
Okay, I can't actually see that, so if everybody's okay, I'll just carry on.
Right, okay, the poll is in progress. We are just waiting for responses. So far, I'll just give you a little short while, 33%, 50% have now voted. I'll just give you a few more moments. Creeping up towards 100% have voted, and as you can't see this on screen, Vicki, I'll take you through the results.
Okay, thank you. The
question was, do you have any of these policies within your organisations? 67% have a sustainability strategy. 83% have a sustainability policy, 67% an environmental strategy, and the same 83% as an environmental policy, and also 83% have a corporate responsibility policy and strategy.
Excellent. So basically, using that information, what we're going to talk about today is basically the ability of organisations to convert that policy and that strategy into practice. Now, we'll be talking about basically the key elements of sustainability and also environmental management. As I've said, how you go about converting your policy into practice, and also some of the processes and standards that are around environmental management and sustainability that you can use to benchmark the work that you're doing. So when we're talking about sustainable supply chain management, there are three key areas. Obviously, the economic benefits. It's very moral and very noble to do environmental management, social responsibility activities within your organisation, but realistically there have to be economic benefits for them to be sustainable. So generally, when we're talking about sustainability and sustainable supply chain management, it's looking at managing the economic factors, so looking at organisational growth, revenue streams, and also the cost of your activities. It's also looking at the social impact, the charitable contributions that your organisation may make, and also whether or not the products you use are fair trade or sustainable, and obviously as well employee welfare. What we'll be focusing on mainly today will be the environmental side, which is looking obviously at resource consumption, waste management and land use, which are the examples here. Because a lot of you will be in the service industry, we'll be looking quite specifically at how that can apply across all industries and not just in the sort of traditional industries that are considered to have a negative environmental impact. So before we get into the detail, I thought it would be helpful to just provide some guiding principles. Now these are the UK government's guiding principles on sustainable development. To be fair, they haven't really been updated significantly recently. These were developed under the coalition, so in the sort of more recent government policies and plans, they're still being adapted and tailored to sort of, you know, the latest conservative policies. However, the principles do still stand. So obviously, again, we have the environmental implications of the work that we do, but also we have about sustainable economy and using sound science. This is something that has become more prevalent in recent years, whereby people are looking for tried and tested evidence-based sciences, particularly around new technologies that are seen to be environmentally sustainable, whereas in the past perhaps it was a bit more of a research-led breaking new ground area. So now it's more about using sound science. Obviously promoting good governance, which is about engagement and working with other people, and ensuring a strong, healthy and just society, which is very much in the corporate and social responsibility space. So as I've said today, we're going to be talking predominantly about environmental management, although we will come back and look at the links between environmental management and some of the other standards when we talk about accreditation and award schemes later in the presentation. So in the UK, obviously a lot of the policies are set by our UK government, and here we have a quote from the Environmental Audit Committee. It's actually been established since 2005, and its role is to oversee basically the activities across government. So unlike a lot of select committees, actually this has a cross-cutting remit and doesn't focus on the work of a single department. Although of course, you know, the DEFRA and the Environment Agency were the departments which had particular attention for this committee. Basically, their view on current government policy is that it's too short term and it needs to be basically a longer term view to transform sectors of the economy that perhaps traditionally haven't been very environmentally aware. Now again, this is sort of, you automatically would think of the more heavy industries, the more manufacturing, but actually when you look at the sort of the view of the Environment Audit Committee to create this sort of new economy, they're actually looking at the whole structure of the economy and the service industries as well, where perhaps in the past they haven't necessarily focused on those areas. So what they're talking about is 3 pillars of sustainable development, which include, as we say, social considerations, well-being and also the environmental management, but also setting targets and actions required from business so that it becomes much more evidence-based. It's less about the principles and the commitments and more about the evidence of delivery. And also agreeing indicators that will be used both by industry and also by government to gauge the level of success. Excuse me. One of the key points they have mentioned is about the need to set minimum standards, and this is particularly around things like business emissions and also around sustainability. And the idea being that these indicators and targets can be measured across the UK and also be included in sustainable development goals when discussing policies both across Europe and across the world. So to bring that a bit closer to home, what we're going to talk about now is actually how you as an organisation can contribute to this wider policy and this wider vision. And generally the structured way of doing that would be through an environmental management system within your organisation. As you've already said from the poll, a lot of you do already have environmental policies, sustainability policies and strategies. But actually the environmental management system provides you the structured framework to manage your impacts that you basically commit to delivering in your policies. So basically an environmental management system is a structured framework for managing your significant impacts on the environment. Now, this isn't a new way of delivering things. Although sustainability is a relatively new buzzword, actually this was really, the history of it can be traced back until the early 90s, particularly following the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And that was when standardization for environmental management systems really came about. We'll see also, when we look at the legislative framework around environmental management systems, that a lot of the legislation was created around the same time and hasn't really changed significantly since. And I think this is predominantly because the legislation that was created then and the systems that were created then were so all-encompassing, there hasn't really been a desperate need to update them or to change them. So basically, interest in environmental performance is still increasing, and organisations are now starting to take account of the environmental consequences of their actions and taking a proactive approach to the environmental challenges, particularly now to look at new technologies and new businesses around the idea of closing the loop around waste management and recycling and using new technologies to provide a more efficient and a more effective way of delivering business. My data is a little out of date, but this time last year, sort of August 2014, more than 4,000 organisations and approximately 7,500 sites were registered for the International Environmental Management Standards. When the environmental management system standardisation came into being, it was predominantly driven through the manufacturing sector and the retail sector. I don't know if you'll be aware, but certainly in the early 1990s, B&Q were a bit of a market leader, and they set out a requirement that all of their subcontractors would have effective environmental management systems because they wanted to be confident in their claims that the products that they were offering actually delivered a sustainable benefit and had minimal environmental impact. Certainly a lot of the companies I worked with then were very much driven by that external influence and a major supplier requiring that level of commitment from them. And it's interesting that that is often still the case, that there will be a driver, be that through the funding agency, be that through government, or be that through partner relationships, where actually individuals are required to set up environmental management systems to help manage their own businesses. The benefits of an environmental management system are really, it's around the structure. It's about basically converting the policy and the commitment from a high level into day-to-day practice. But as we said at the start, it can't just be done from a kind of a moral perspective or a positive benefit perspective. It generally has to deliver economic benefits as well. But happily, by reducing waste, sort of the increase in by reducing the use of energy or the reducing of resources and the reduction in one of those things where the driver doesn't have to necessarily be an environmental benefit, but by looking at your organisation in a different way, you can actually generate economic benefits, which then have a knock-on effect of delivering environmental benefits. There's also the ability to basically reduce your risk. Although a lot of service industries don't have a significant risk to detrimental environmental activities, there is still a risk that the activities that you're doing could have a negative impact on the environment that perhaps your customers wouldn't particularly be impressed by, or that may cause concern for some of your subcontractors or suppliers. So again, it's a public relations exercise sometimes, but that can also be a good thing. And also there's scope to integrate your environmental management system with a lot of existing systems that you will have, particularly around quality improvement and delivery. There's no reason why these systems have to operate independently because they're both aiming for the same kind of sustainable outcomes. So we're going to start looking into some detail about how the environmental management system would work, and it's basically summarized in the diagram I've just put up there, which is act, plan, do, and check. And again, for a lot of you, this will be very familiar in terms of your usual quality systems, the way that you look at the work that you're doing. It's about delivering, it's about checking your actions, and then it's about continually improving them. This slide just shows a nice example of where basically the movement from your environmental policy through planning and implementation, into audit and checking, and then into review, delivers that level of continual improvement. So we're going to go through the key stages of an environmental management system and basically how you would go about implementing an environmental management system within your organisation. So as I've said already, it's a fairly straightforward step-by-step process that's designed deliberately to take you from the initial thinking and commitment through a review into the development of policy and identifying where you have significant environmental aspects that need to be managed, looking at the legislation that may impact on you, setting objectives and targets and an associated management programme, and then auditing that programme to make sure it's effective, and then delivering training and awareness raising. So if we think about the initial review, many of you have said you already have an environmental policy. Excuse me. So it may well be that you've already identified the key issues and impacts, but often in this sort of environment, people don't always think about the opportunities and where there might be scope to either embed new technologies or look at different ways of delivering your business, or looking at different processes that not only deliver the economic benefits we've talked about, but also can deliver social and economic and environmental benefits as well. So really this initial review is designed to look at the way in which your organisation operates and how that can have an impact on the environment. It can identify where documentation or processes need to be put in place, and it can also prioritise opportunities to improve performance. If you also have a legal compliance requirement, it can be a helpful way of looking at what your legal compliance requirements are. As I've said before, in the service industry, it isn't necessarily a legally driven approach, but certainly for some of the other people I work with in the waste and manufacturing industries, often legal compliance and adherence to the legislation is a dominant driver. Particularly important is looking at what others are doing, again to share best practice and to get ideas for how implementing an environmental management system within your organisation can deliver benefits that are comparable and measurable to other organisations. One of the things that's most helpful about the initial review is actually gathering the data that basically allows you to understand what the possible issues and impacts are in your organisation. So it's things like looking at your current processes and practices, linking it to things like health and safety issues, and basically reviewing what you're doing already to see whether or not there's scope to improve. By doing this, it will help you rethink and reconsider your environmental policy. Now, we talked about environmental policy right at the beginning, and often a lot of organisations will have an environmental policy either to meet the requirements of a contract, in the sense that they're expected to have one, potentially to demonstrate a high level of commitment to environmental management and sustainability, for public relations reasons, so improving customer relationships, or to promote good practice. But really, when it comes to an environmental policy, it's a statement of commitment that has to be underpinned by good practice. And that's where the more detailed environmental management system comes in. So having established the environmental policy for your organisation, to turn that into a reality, it's really a case of looking at what the key environmental issues are that affect your business. And as you'll see from here, they can be many and wide-ranging. And also, they're not the traditional kind of environmental contamination type issues that you may associate with traditional heavy industry. Everything from transport and logistics, your water use, the way you plan and develop your own site, air pollution, noise control, all of these are relevant to businesses operating currently and are not just about the potentially dirty industries that were perhaps targeted by the legislative framework in the past. So really, when you're looking at your environmental aspects, it's an opportunity to really go into detail about what are the kind of activities that you do that affect the environment and how might you measure, manage, and then improve those. One of the important things to think about as well is potentially your business could have a number of environmental aspects, a number of environmental impacts, but it's about prioritizing those and understanding which ones are significant and which ones are nice to have, so that you know when you're developing your system that you've done it in a systematic way and it's basically delivering the best possible outcomes for your business and for the environmental impact it potentially has. So as you can see here, there's a nice flowchart to think about how you would actually deliver that, so that you would look at the nature of the impact and then whether it has a significant impact either on the environment, whether it's covered by legislation, or whether it's a concern to your customers. And then actually, if it's not a particularly significant impact, whether you should deliver improvements against it and then reassess those periodically, perhaps as interest changes or as technology improves or priorities shift. And that gives you the opportunity to keep your environmental management system current and active. I'm going to touch on legislation here, but I'll come back to it later because there's an opportunity really to think about how legislation can have a direct impact on some of the activities you may do within an environmental management system. So really, within the environmental management system framework, looking at legislation is actually basically pulling all of the information that you need into one single place so that you know where it is and you can monitor it for changes. Generally, the approach taken is a register of legislation. There isn't an expectation that you will suddenly keep all copies of detailed legislation in your offices, but a lot of the information is available online and picks up the kind of key issues that the legislation covers. It basically helps you shape and understand the processes that have an impact on the environment and helps you think about how you would actually manage them. Just as an illustration, I've put up here some of the key elements of environmental legislation that have been put in place since 1974. As you'll see, there aren't that many. It's a relatively small legislative framework. There's a lot more in specific industries where the risk of environmental damage is quite high. But I suppose in a similar way with health and safety, a lot of the legislation was established quite early on and hasn't actually changed that much. The Control of Pollution Act that was first agreed in 1974 basically prevented the deposit of any kind of waste on any kind of land. So it was quite broad brush, but that was about as far as it went. It was mainly about waste management back in 1974. The Wildlife and Countryside Amendment Acts came along and they were looking at the use of land particularly, but I've highlighted here the Environmental Protection Act, mainly because I personally think it's the most interesting piece of legislation because it pretty much covers everything you could ever do with regard to environmental damage. So it talks about the Clean Air Act, it talks about radioactive substances, it even picks up genetically modified organisms, it talks about controlling import, export, use, supply and storage of waste, it talks about controlling hazardous substances, it talks about the provisions for dumping waste at sea, oil pollution, the control of dogs, the burning of crop residues, and also the scope to make financial assistance for purposes connected with the environment. So basically, the legislation at that point went for a catch-all. And as you can see, as a result, there's been very little changes to it since. There have been some tweaks to that legislation, but really a lot of it is based on the legislation that was formed in the 1990s. The only notable change really to that is the Climate Change Act that was brought in 2008. And that was predominantly about setting targets to cut national emissions by 80% by 2050. So this basically provided a framework for countries to basically set the target and set stages to this target over the time leading to 2050. Although obviously the Climate Change Act applies specifically to England, it's English legislation, similar acts have been enacted across the world. So having established the fact that the legislative framework is pretty all-encompassing, it's worth now looking at how you would go about setting objectives and targets that delivered improvements to your environmental performance within the context of that legislation. Now again, I'm not going to go into detail about how you go about setting objectives and targets. I know everybody here is familiar with that, but I thought it was worth refreshing our memory on a couple of things that we need to bear in mind when thinking about setting objectives. And this is about being specific, having realistic targets, setting objectives that are based on data that you've collected already from your initial review, so they can be measured and they can be monitored, and also tailoring them to address your significant environmental aspects. So it may be that you can gather a lot of data on a particular subject or particular impact, but really you should be focusing on the objectives that will deliver improvements against your most significant environmental aspects. And as we know, when setting objectives, they should be SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So having done the work to review your environmental impacts, to gather the data that's needed, and to set your objectives and targets, the meat of an environmental management system will obviously be in the management program. And this is where you're looking at getting commitment from across the organisation to deliver against your objectives and targets, to provide the environmental improvement that you've committed to deliver in your policy. It also provides the opportunity to be clear about who is responsible and what level of authority people have regarding the environmental management system. So, for example, when making decisions, to what extent they would have the authority to take into account environmental considerations. And of course, because we're looking at standardisation, there would be documented procedures for all of the processes and activities that have significant potential environmental impact. Many organisations actually create what they call a management manual, and a lot of this relates back to the quality standards, in the sense that there would be a single place where all of the documentation that related to that management programme would be held. The advice now is that those manuals should be short and generally try and focus around processes and process mapping, rather than the extensive kind of tomes that I've seen in the past, which end up getting put in a drawer and nobody looks at. It's all about making it relevant to everybody's day job, and therefore the management program is incorporated within the day-to-day management. And finally, as we'll all be aware, the process of audit and review. So again, this is very much about the continuous improvement cycle, so that every time you do something, you check it, you act, and you plan to improve it. So you constantly have this ongoing cycle of continual improvement that basically helps you to deliver improvements to your environmental management system as the world around you changes and as your organisation changes with it. The final point around environmental management systems is thinking about awareness raising. You've potentially done a lot of work to gather the commitment of your senior management, to identify your environmental aspects, to put in place targets, to put in place a management plan. But really it's about awareness raising across the whole organisation. The most straightforward thing to do, first of all, would be to identify the environmental training needs. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a complex program of training, but it's actually identifying the functional training needs, where perhaps people who are changing procedures or practices need to understand the difference and how that will then impact on the environment. Looking at individual training needs, where people are possibly more or less advanced than others. General awareness raising, so across the organisation, making sure people understand the commitment that's been made and the plans that are being put in place. And also something that's worked quite well, particularly around kind of local councils and large organisations, is the idea of having environmental representatives. So again, they're maintaining that ongoing flow of communication and keeping up to speed with what's changing within the environmental management framework, but also being able to highlight any potential improvements that can be made, and also talking to individual employees in an informal way about the environmental management system. With any kind of training needs, it's worth developing a plan, as you all know, that looks at the learning aims and objectives, delivers a training plan, and also looks at engagement and communication for your stakeholders. So in summary, this is the process summary that is generally provided when people are looking at implementing environmental management systems, either aiming to get them accredited or basically looking at improving their own performance. it's a progressive stage from commitment through to identification and defining objectives, and then through implementation and checking and continuous improvement. I'll talk later about stage 6, which is referred to as EMS acknowledgement under some of the commonly known schemes for environmental management systems. I'll pause there because that was basically an overview of how environmental management systems have been established and how they can operate, just to see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Vicky. Just having a look to see if there are any questions coming into the chat box or question box. Nothing as yet, but we'll leave that for a few moments just to give you an opportunity to ask questions on that session. Doesn't appear to be any questions at the moment, Vicky. I think that's a good sign that that's a very comprehensive session so far. So
that's good news. I'll take that as a compliment.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so basically what we're going to look at now then, so that was very much around the framework of an environmental management systems and how they exist and how they're structured. But obviously, for those of you who perhaps haven't gone down the route of implementing an environmental management system, and also potentially thinking about, well, how does this affect me within a service industry, I thought it would be helpful for us to actually pick on a specific example and see how that would translate into practice. So hopefully this time there may be some more questions generated if you're starting to think about how does this relate to my organisation. So basically, on the same principle around closing the gap between policy and practice, what we're going to look at now is how you would turn your commitment into a practical reality. And the example I'm going to use is around reducing your carbon footprint. Now, the reason I've chosen this is because basically all organisations have an opportunity to reduce their carbon emissions, regardless of the nature of their business, just because of how carbon emissions are generated. And it's mainly around basically greenhouse gas emissions that we're all very familiar with. So many environmental policies would have the statement that we aim to reduce our carbon footprint, but I think it's an opportune moment now to look at what actually that means in practice. So rather than just having it as a commitment, how would you actually implement something like that and then go on to monitor and measure it in the future? We have an interesting diagram here which basically illustrates the amount of space a ton of carbon dioxide takes up, which is quite a bit bigger than I thought, but basically illustrates the fact that this is a global problem and a ton of carbon dioxide is something that if we can reduce it, we are significantly reducing the impact on our own environment. So basically, what we talk about when we look at carbon footprints are organisational carbon footprints, and this is about a mechanism for measuring those greenhouse gas emissions from the nature of the activities that an organisation would do. And again, this is particularly relevant to industries who are perhaps more service focused rather than product focused. It means that there are still opportunities for us to consider our carbon footprint when looking at our organisations, buildings, processes, and also our use of transport. Of course, organisations that create products would also be looking at their greenhouse gas emissions over the life cycle of that product, but again would be picking up the broader implications of production, distribution, consumption, and disposal. So it's not just about the creation, it's also about how that product is then used and disposed of in the future. So just to be clear, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is basically a standard that is used to account for greenhouse gas emissions, and it categorises emissions into 3 groups or scopes. So the first scope would be direct emissions. So they're activities that are within your organisation's control. So it's processes that take place on site, it's the use of company vehicles. Scope 2 would be things that perhaps you were indirect to you. It was an item or a product that you were using, but you weren't directly responsible for its production. So generally the examples given here are heating and lighting. So although you may not be an energy company, you are still heating and lighting your offices, you're still using power to run your business. And then scope 3 is basically a catch-all for all other emissions. And here it's looking at things like business travel and waste disposal. There's also the scope to look at water consumption, employee commuting, all the kind of activities that don't necessarily fall within scope 1 and 2. So again, it's about looking at all of the activities across your organisation. I thought it was helpful just at this point to show, when we're talking about data, the actual increase in global carbon emissions that's happened. And again, this slide runs out at the end of 2000, but I think it's fair to say it's unlikely that the trend has reversed particularly. So we can see a massive spike in global carbon emissions, which is obviously why it's got the level of interest that it has at the moment. So basically, if we were looking at particular activities, such as reducing our carbon footprint, you would follow exactly the same processes that we talked about when we were talking about the structure of an environmental management system. So your starting point would be your initial review, where you would look in detail at the kind of issues that would contribute to your own carbon footprint. And as we've said already, looking across the different scopes and the measurements of the greenhouse gas emissions, it would be energy use, transport and logistics, your site and building management, and your waste. Issues that are consistent across all organisations and can actually be measured quite comprehensively. And that's where your initial review would come in, and this is where we're looking at the practical steps of how you would actually understand your impact and the level of carbon footprint that your organisation has. So first of all, thinking about energy use, it's providing the data and the background to understand exactly what you're using it for, where there are variations in that demand and what's causing them, how it's controlled, how you manage your relationship with your supplier, although if anyone can influence energy suppliers, I will be very impressed. Whether or not your equipment purchasing considers energy issues, so are you looking at new technologies, energy efficient machines, what opportunities exist. Again, the initial review is a point to reflect on what you're doing, but also a point to reflect on what potential opportunities there may be. And also, particularly within the service sector, what kind of new technology is there that supports reduced energy use? So all of these things are the kind of questions you want to be considering right at the outset before you decide exactly how you're going to manage the reduction in your carbon footprint, because this will give you the data on which to base the rest of your activities. We'll do the same with transport and logistics. We identified that as one of the elements that contributed to carbon footprint. So again, it's a case of gathering appropriate data, looking at what you're currently spending on transportation, what is the nature of the vehicles within your organisation, both in terms of the vehicles that are company owned, but also looking at about commuting, car sharing, how people actually travel to and from your premises, looking at how there's scope to reduce those costs, maybe through regular maintenance, possibly even driver training, and also whether or not when you're purchasing new vehicles you consider efficiency and energy issues. So again, it's looking at what you're doing now, but not losing sight of the fact there are opportunities to do things differently. Site management. A lot of people will not necessarily be responsible for their own site development, but yet they will still be responsible for the site maintenance and management, general housekeeping, and also things like energy efficiency within the sites that you're based in. There may well not be opportunities for investment and improvement, but you never know. It's always worth looking and talking to the people who own your site, or if you rent sites, who you rent them from. And then thinking about site procedures where staff may need training and whether or not there are any procedures in place already. Again, this is about gathering the information that you need to make a judgment on whether or not it's an aspect you need to consider when looking at reducing your carbon footprint. And finally, waste. Any item that's sent for disposal will release energy. There's been energy created from it, and therefore there will be a carbon footprint impact of it. So again, it's gathering the data about the types of waste, where it's generated, what opportunities you're already doing and where there may be more, looking at storage and costs, and also making sure things are compliant and that staff are appropriately trained. So at this point, we've basically gathered the information from this initial review to establish where the potential impacts are and where, by changing our behaviours and our practices, we can potentially reduce our carbon footprint. And again, the flowchart I showed you earlier gives you an opportunity to prioritise those and to work out where you're going to focus your attention. It's quite feasible following an initial review, you'll come up with a lot of ideas and a lot of potential opportunities, but it's really a case of looking at those that will have the most benefit and prioritising the delivery of those. Another way of looking at deciding which environmental aspect to concentrate on once you've actually gone through and worked out the potential impact is looking at developing a matrix. This is quite commonly done, so it looks at a systematic way of establishing whether or not this should be a priority aspect for your organisation. And I would imagine here again it's predominantly going to be around volumes or around the level of interest you got from your customers and stakeholders in managing that particular element of reducing your carbon footprint. Obviously, we talked previously about setting up a register of legislation, and I mentioned the fact that there wasn't a great deal of environmental legislation, and that a lot of the key legislation that's been in place since 74 and then 1990 covered a great range of environmental impacts and how to manage them. But there are some relevant legislations when you're looking particularly around waste. We picked up on the Climate Change Act and the reduction, but that's very much around target setting. When we're looking at waste, it's about understanding what you can and can't dispose of and where you can and can't dispose of that. And a lot of it will depend on the nature of the waste that you're involved with. So again, in the service industry, it's going to be relatively small, but particularly the WEEE regulations, the waste electronic and electrical equipment regulations, give guidance on what can and can't be disposed of in terms of technological kit. So if you're looking at replacing computers and IT, the way in which that has to be disposed will be picked up as part of the legislative framework. So again, this can help you think about how you implement your environmental management system to make sure you're delivering both the minimum and also the spirit of the legislation that's been written to control that kind of waste. This is just a brief example of a register of legislation, and again it picks up on the fact that I was saying you wouldn't be expected to hold copies of all of the relevant legislation in your particular office, but it's relating the legislation directly to a process that you have within your organisation, naming the person responsible who would be overseeing the compliance, but also thinking about any related procedures that may actually impact on those kind of activities. So for example here, when we talked previously about the waste electrical and electronic equipment regulations 2006, it would be looking at when you were perhaps doing a systematic IT upgrade, you would expect your IT director, if you have one, to be responsible for that. But also you're looking at the purchasing route and also the disposal route for your old kit. So it just gives you a nice way of turning a legislative framework that's quite abstract into giving it direct applicability to the processes that you're delivering in your organisation. So we've established basically the key aspects that impact on our proposal to reduce carbon footprint that we've potentially committed to in environmental policy. And we talked before about objectives and targets being smart, being specific to your organisation, being measurable and being based on data. So what I've given you here is just an indication of how you could actually develop targets around the ambition to reduce carbon footprint in a way that is measurable and reportable and also can be audited after the fact. So here you're actually giving figures for reductions which will be based on the data you've gathered in your initial review, and also giving commitment timeframes. So you're either giving a specific date by which an activity will happen or a time frame in terms of X number of years by which you will look to improve and upgrade to reduce and deliver against your carbon footprint commitments. Obviously, these will be tailored very much to the nature of your organisation and where you find the most significant environmental aspects to be, but it's always worth trying to make these targets numerical and time-bound, because that gives you something to measure against when you're auditing your environmental management system. And as I said before, they should always be smart. So we have our objectives and targets. The expectation now is to implement a management plan to be able to deliver those. Now again, just because these activities may seem to be relatively small, it doesn't mean that they don't have a significant impact on your electricity use, for example, which will be one of the most dominant factors impacting on your carbon footprint. So it can be a case of making a series of statements or commitments that basically mean you're going to reduce your electricity use without having a detrimental impact on the way you run your business. So it can be as simple as using sensors, installing energy efficient lights, having technology that basically maximizes the use of energy and responds to changes in climate, changes in temperature, without you having to actively do something. So you're not necessarily putting the onus on the individuals in the room, but you're using the technology to maximize efficiencies. And a lot of the technology developments over recent years have been very much around energy efficient equipment and office solutions that can save you energy. And again, some examples here of fairly straightforward activities that can be put in place that don't have a significant cost, don't have a significant impact on individuals, but can, gathered together, actually reduce your energy use. And again, if you did one or two of these, the impact would be fairly small. But if you looked at all of the potential opportunities to reduce your energy, then the combined effect of all people within your organisation delivering that would probably be quite significant. And that's why it's important to set targets that are measurable, because then you actually can show that impact, and it makes it much more real for the people who were involved with the process. So having established the activities you're going to take and the targets that you're planning to achieve, obviously the best way to ensure that you deliver against those is through a process of monitoring and measurement. And here it's about defined responsibilities. You need to be clear about who will be monitoring what and how they're going to be doing that. And again, in a kind of circular fashion, this links back to the measuring you did when you were looking at the initial environmental assessment at the outset. Once you know what the data is, you can then set up the most appropriate person to regularly monitor that. Again, we've talked about defining timescales. So if you have a commitment to deliver something within a 5-year period, it doesn't make sense to monitor it on a weekly basis, but it certainly does make sense to monitor it annually or possibly even every 6 months. Agreed reporting arrangements are always helpful so that people know what's being measured, what's being monitored, and also it gives you an opportunity to provide updates, both to the management team who would be committed to the environmental improvements committed in your policy, but also to staff who are generally involved with the changes that need to be made to actually deliver against those commitments. It also allows you to mitigate underperformance. It may be that your targets are too ambitious, or it may be that your management plan just isn't being delivered as comprehensively as you thought it was. So this gives you an opportunity to unpick why that's happening. And obviously on a positive side, gives you the opportunity to deliver continuous improvement. Finally, one of the things we talked about before was about the importance of communication and training. And again, when you're looking at specific activities, it means that the training can be much more tailored and much more specific to basically what people will be doing and the impact it will have on them. So obviously in this case, you'll be looking at staff implementing a lot of the management practices that you're talking about. But you'd also be advising your stakeholders of the changes that you're making, so when they come to see you on site, there are certain expectations they would need to meet. And the same can be true of suppliers, because basically it may be that you've got a long-standing relationship with the supplier, but you're looking at changing the kind of products you buy from them, and you would want them to go along with you in a partnership fashion, or you might even look at changing suppliers and changing your procurement routes. And then obviously regulators. A lot of regulators at the moment are interested in the actual impact that you're having in terms of the positive changes. So having regular information that you can then communicate to your regulators about the improvements that you've put in place are always helpful. And obviously it's important to identify the training needs. We've touched on this before, but it's really around changes that you're making to processes and also changes that you're making to procedures, and ensuring all of the people involved with those understand how things have changed and why. And then obviously we all come from a kind of, training and delivery background, so it's looking at different mechanisms for communicating and training, and whether that's classroom-based training, taking people into a room and telling them about what needs to be done, whether you use e-learning. There's a lot of very good environmental e-learning out there that is everything from the kind of complex environmental management systems right through to step-by-step guides on how to reduce the impact. Workshops, so getting input from staff, is always helpful, because you'll be surprised that there'll be people with ideas that you'd probably not even thought about. And then obviously a broader opportunity to communicate with staff, however you do at the moment, but adding to that to provide updates on the targets that you're delivering and the changes and the positive impact that their activities are having. So that was basically trying to give a little bit more reality to the principles of implementing an environmental management system, and how you would do that with an environmental concern that's really applicable across all businesses and across all organisations. So I hope you found that helpful, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
That's excellent, Vicky. Thank you. We'll just wait a few moments to see if there's any questions that pop up in the box or through the chat room. Nothing as yet. I think obviously if there are any questions post the webinar, then what I will do is make sure that obviously any questions that are raised are passed on to Vicky, because obviously probably people need some thinking time. And also we'll have an audience of our partners and associates who will be able to view this through the YouTube link. So again, there'll be another audience that may also have questions. So rest assured, if there are any questions from this session, then I'll make sure they're passed on to Vicky, so that Vicky's able to provide a response to you.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I'm conscious of the time, but there were just a couple of other things I wanted to flag, if that's all right, Jo.
Please
about how you may go around sort of getting recognition for the work that you're doing, and also a couple of examples of organisations who've done quite a lot in environmental management systems that it might be worth partners, if they're interested in, just having a little bit of a look around. There's a lot of information from them on their websites that tell you about what they're doing.
Please do, yes.
So basically, having established an environmental management system, it's always a good thing to get some kind of recognition for all the work that you've put in. And at the moment, there are three main accreditation bodies that look at environmental management systems. ISO 14001 is quite commonly adopted. It's the international standard, and people may well be familiar with it, ISO 9001 being the quality standard, quality improvement standard. And basically that's an internationally recognized standard that looks at accrediting the work that you've done in implementing your environmental management system. So if you remember that chart from fairly early on in the slides, that's the final step in the process. There's also EMAS, which I can never remember. It's the European Union Eco-Management and Audit Scheme, which is why I can never remember what it's called. And it basically builds on ISO 14001, but provides additional information about credibility and transparency. So there's more external reporting with EMAS. So it gives you an opportunity to provide further information to your partners and also to the wider kind of the wider world, really, about the work that you're doing to actually implement and embed environmental management systems. And then there's also the ACORN scheme. Now, the ACORN scheme is based around the British standard BS 8555, which people may be familiar with. And the benefits of this is it's designed to be a step-by-step approach that you can dip in and out of, so you only need to take it as far as you're comfortable with at the time. So it's a little bit more flexible than ISO 14001 and EMAS, and it's endorsed by the Institute of Environmental Management Association, so it does have the same level of kudos. It's just a more straightforward way of getting that external recognition. Touching back on what we talked about originally, there is also accreditation available for the activities you do in the social responsibility space, and this is around corporate social responsibility as represented by ISO 26000. Again, not quite sure where they get the numbers from. But basically this is about looking at your corporate social responsibility as an organisation, the nature of voluntary initiatives that you potentially implement both within your organisation and also across your partners, but it's also looking about your consumers' health and safety, sustainable consumption, and education and awareness. So it picks up on a lot of the key elements of environmental management systems, but obviously the focus is very much on social responsibility, of which environmental management is a relatively small part. And then a relatively new form of accreditation is now being developed by ISO, which is around energy management. And this is focused very much on, specifically, rather than having a broad range of environmental impacts that you're looking at, this is very much about how you manage your energy. So it looks at the kind of activities we were talking about in that earlier example about carbon footprinting, about how you set targets and reduce your ongoing energy management. So all of these are mechanisms by which you can get external recognition. I think I've talked through all of that. So this is quite a nice diagram that basically shows the difference between the ISO standard and the EMAS standard. And as I said, it's very much about external verification of your performance and public reporting. So if that's where you're looking, if you're being driven into the kind of standard approach because of external pressure from customers or suppliers and stakeholders, EMAS provides you a regular mechanism for public reporting. ISO 14001, of course you can talk about it, but the focus is much more on your internal processes and practices. In terms of 26000 accreditation, as you can see here, environment is an element of it, but it also looks at community development, human rights, your own labour practices. So if you're looking at something slightly broader than an environmental management system, there is still scope for you to be accredited for the work that you're doing. And as we said, ISO 50001 is very much the same principles, but around specifically energy management and continual improvement. I just wanted to use a single slide, and I won't go into details here, about the plethora of awards there are currently for environmental management, for sustainability, for green practices. So there's always a reason to celebrate any kind of achievement. And basically, a lot of organisations are doing very well, developing their own either technological improvements, their own environmental management systems, their sustainable business practices, and there's recognition out there for the organisations that are doing that. And I think this is a good point to summarise on in terms of thinking about best practice, which I won't go into detail here, but there's certainly organisations that are worth you looking into. The University of Leeds, who I worked with for 5 years, they've developed a sustainability strategy that picks up on a lot of the elements that we talked about here. This information is available on their website and can be downloaded. If you're interested, I certainly would recommend having a look at it in terms of what a large education institution is doing in this sustainability space. Newcastle City Council, another example of quite a large organisation that's looking at embedding environmental management systems across the City Council and across their offices and their departments. They were predominantly doing this to apply for the Green City Awards, but are continuing to develop their sustainability strategy. And then just to provide some context, you don't have to be a large organisation or a large council to be able to do this. A company I particularly think is interesting is Park Lane Press Limited, who are using new technologies to reduce water consumption, to reduce waste, and have been committed to delivering an accredited environmental management system for a number of years now. So all of these are worth looking at the details that is available on their websites about what they're doing to basically deliver best practice. And that's everything from me. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar.
Thank you very much, Vicki. That has been an absolutely comprehensive session and one that I've certainly enjoyed. And we have a couple of colleagues who have also viewed as well, who are the supply chain and contract managers. And be pleased to say that obviously they'll be picking up this agenda with all our partners, as it's something that obviously we discuss with all partners on an ongoing basis through our regular monitoring and review. And we wish to obviously provide continued support to our partners on this subject. So we certainly hope that you've all found this session informative. Certainly we have. There's a couple of questions, Vicki, that have popped up in the box. So the first one is from Melanie Southall, who asked, will we have the YouTube link emailed to us? Yes, absolutely, Melanie. We'll get this downloaded this afternoon, and that will come out to you via our provider portal probably by about 9:30 tomorrow morning, so you will have that. And an acknowledgement here from Julie Earnshaw. Thanks for providing the level of information and support to us. So another satisfied customer there, Vicki, so thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Many thanks. If there are no more questions, I'll give sort of 10 seconds just in case there are any further questions. We have a question here. Can we also have some handouts that we can distribute to partners? Absolutely. We will clearly send around a copy of the slides, and also obviously we talked around best practice there, and Vicki signposted us to some excellent sources for best practice. So I'm sure we can, if there are any websites, then we can also email those around to partners as well. And I think that should conclude the questions. So just once again, thank you very much, Vicki. Excellent session. And what we'll do now is we'll close the webinar and ask partners that are online still to ideally complete a short survey just for some feedback on how this session has been of use to you. And obviously we'll take your feedback and ensure that all that is fed back into our supply chain and contract managers. So on that note, hope you enjoyed the session, and thank you very much and goodbye.